Okay, so it's just gone 10. So here I'm going to start. We're discussing today on our Process Safety Forum, organizational change. So I'm going to give a very quick, as before, I'm going to give a very quick introduction to myself and then to the topic as well. And then I'm going to open the floor for questions. Now, I've done a lot of organizational changes. I've been subject to organizational change. I've been part of forming an organizational change and making sure it's executed well. So I will answer questions, but there are also, I know a lot of people on the line who have really good experience of this and a lot of people who are actually going through this. So please feel free to share your advice and tips in the chat, and I'll read those out for the answers. And then in the last 5 minutes, I'll wrap up and I'll announce next week's topic. So a quick introduction to myself for anyone who hasn't joined the webinar before. My name's Louise Whiting. I have worked for over 11 years in the oil and gas industry in large operators, BP and Shell. And I've now started my own company, Barberton Limited, and I chair these process safety forums once a week where we share good process safety knowledge on different topics. And as I said, today we're going to be doing organizational change. Over the 11 years that I spent in operating assets, I think I saw an organizational change at least once a year. Now that was either I was changing roles or somebody around me was changing roles, or the organization itself was growing or contracting in accordance probably with the oil price. And then there were a couple later on in my career where I was part of structuring the organizational change and making sure that we could achieve good process safety performance despite the change. So I'm going to give you a quick introduction to organizational change as I see it, and feel free to add more information in the chat box if you want. Organizational change falls into a few categories. You could have a new person in an existing role. So you have your organizational structure, and for some reason someone needs to move on, maybe they retire or maybe they're going to a new role, and you get a new person into an existing role. The next type is there's a new role in an expanding organization. So you start to realize that maybe you need 5 process engineers or 4 rather than 4, or maybe you need 2 loss prevention engineers rather than 1. You're starting to build your organization and you're getting new roles. So when you're expanding your organization like that, that is another way of organizational change. There's another one, which is a reorganization. So you've been running your organization for a little while. You kind of feel that you're not agile enough. Maybe the way that you're structured is preventing communication between departments. And so you decide to restructure or reorganize the people that you already have. You're not downsizing, you're not upsizing, you're just reorganizing those people into a different structure. And then the last one, which is probably the most common one that you guys are seeing at the moment, is a downsizing, normally driven by financial factors. It's downsizing the organization, so reducing the number and thereby combining several roles into one for one person to deliver. So as I said before, just for those who've just joined, if you need to ask a question, there's a Q&A function in the chat box. Just click on the question mark and then type your question. Be able to pop them up after this. So some keys to good organizational change management. Right? So if you want to do good change management, you need to be really clear about what the responsibilities and accountabilities are, right? They're different things. So accountability means that if something goes wrong, that person is accountable. That's often someone quite senior in the organization, like maybe the asset manager, the general manager, or the offshore installation manager if you're working offshore. Then there are people who are responsible. So they do the day-to-day application which meets the objective. For example, you might have a maintenance manager who is responsible for ensuring the resources are there to deliver maintenance. And then you may have a sort of mechanical engineer who is responsible for his tasks that day to make sure that those safety critical elements he manages are maintained in a way which is consistent with their function. So responsibility varies, and you might have several responsibilities which all meet the one accountability. And the accountability, as I said, is normally higher up in your organization. So what does organizational change mean for process safety? There are some key accountabilities and responsibilities associated with process safety. You can normally identify these if you have a look at your bow tie, if it's well structured. There'll be things like engineering your safety critical elements. Then there'll be installing your safety critical elements. So that's another role of another part of the organization. And then there'll be operating and maintaining. So each one of those four represents some element of process safety management. And if one of those four fails, for example, you don't engineer it properly, it's not going to meet its design intent. If you don't maintain it properly, it will not meet its design intent when called to operate. If you don't operate it properly, etc. So there are different roles, and you can identify that from your bow tie. There are some other roles which you can't really see in your bow tie because they're overarching. For example, you need the permit to work system, right? And that may not be specifically listed on your bow tie, but that underpins all of the work that you do associated with your bow tie. So that then again, making sure that that permit to work system is working well becomes another key accountability and responsibility. To allow the organizational change to be effective, you need to know what your accountabilities and responsibilities are. If you don't know what they are, it's very difficult to then go through to the next step, which is mapping them to roles and people in the organization. Okay, knowing whether it's the asset manager or the general manager who is accountable for maintenance program, knowing whether it is the mechanical department or the instrument department responsible for maintaining a certain type of equipment. Those things need to be mapped down into your organization so that each person knows what their roles and responsibilities are in the organization in maintaining good process safety. And that's the last one here. People actually need to know their accountabilities and responsibilities. If they don't know them, they may naturally do them because they have a good sense of what their role is. But there are a large number of people who, if they don't know that they're responsible or accountable for those things, will not do them. So now that is in your organization as it is. When we move into a change, we need to replicate that again. If we are merging roles in, we need to know which are the responsibilities and accountabilities linked to process safety. Now, sometimes when you get a job description, you think, oh yeah, that sounds all really good, but it is so high level because it's been copied over and over again that you don't actually know what it means in your asset. So making sure it's specific and making sure which of those accountabilities and responsibilities are mapped to process safety. When you start to merge your organization, it allows you to take away the things that are not associated with process safety, because if you had 2 people or 3 people doing roles and you try and put them into one, there's a good chance that one person's not going to be able to do everything, but try and make sure that they can do what is associated with process safety. And then the last one, I just wanted to pop this slide up. This was from the previous webinar we did with Peter. So you can see here, these are some of our safety critical element categories. And so in each of these, we would have several different people associated with the barriers. We would need engineering, installation, commissioning, maintenance. So that's all I have now for our presentation. If you guys have any questions, you want to share some good practice of what you guys are doing at the moment in your organization, managing your organizational change. How are you getting through the COVID with people going off sick, maybe having to isolate for 2 weeks when they don't, when maybe they aren't sick, but they're still having to isolate. So if you guys can start typing in the chat, I will, so I'm going to share some of the experience that I've had in an organizational change. So when we were doing quite a large downsizing, it was about 40%. And we were trying to push the operations team quite a bit smaller because they had the highest cost associated with them because they were back-to-backs. When we had a look at the safety critical roles associated with the organization, with the frontline organization, we realized that on a day-to-day basis, we didn't actually need as many operators as we had. The pinch point came actually when you started to look at the emergency response. How did how were we going to be able to achieve all of those things that we needed to do during an emergency response with a fewer number of people? And we realized actually that we couldn't. We needed a certain number of people to achieve emergency response roles, and that's actually what drove the size of our organization going forward. So although we potentially had a bit of ullage during normal operation, it was the emergency response that drove the number of people in the field. So I've had a comment from Masood Khan from India, but I haven't seen any questions. If anyone has any questions, please feel free. Has anybody been subject to organizational change where they actually have no idea what their role is going forward because nobody's told them? And then how do you get through that? How do you move through to finding your space and making sure that all the critical things are done? I know that sometimes when I've joined an organization, I've had a generic job description, and when I'm trying to think about, well, what does the safety case want me to do? It's nothing to do with my job description, and it can be really tricky to try and find that out when you're joining a new organization and a new facility that you're not familiar with yet. So getting a really good handover can help with your organizational change. So another thing to do is, how do you document your accountability and responsibility? So sometimes it can be difficult to make sure that it's very clear for people. When you apply for a job, you see your accountabilities and responsibilities, but there's a good chance that you never look at that again once you start your role. So has anybody got any good practice on how you guys document your accountability and responsibility where you are, making sure that that is something that's updated regularly? If there's any changes to your safety case, your safety critical elements, your safety critical tasks, how does that work at your facility? I haven't actually seen that done well in my organizations. In general, the only time I see my job description is when I join. So I've had something from Henry. So a job competence profile should identify what fulfilled and what are the gaps. So yeah, that's a great point, Henry. So when you start to join an organization and you have your roles and responsibilities, you might not actually have the competence to deliver everything on your list. But actually having a list where you can measure yourself against is really useful, because you can start to identify where your gaps are, so that you can start to close those. If you don't know where your gaps are, you don't know where you need support, you don't know where you might need additional training, or you might need expertise from outside. So that's a great point, Henry, making sure that you know what your responsibilities are, you do a gap assessment against that, and then start to close the gaps. That's something I've seen a lot. So I've seen it done really well with regards to frontline barrier management. So people in the front line often assess what they need to do to be able to do their task and whether they have a gap, and they get training. But in the engineering world, we don't often reflect that way, and that might be because we don't have a lot of time, or it might be because our roles are not normally that clear. So I've had another comment from Ashraf. In my past role, I've added the brief job roles in the process safety management system. So Ashraf, can you tell us, when you say the process safety management system, have you documented that in a safety case, or have you had another document where you've put that information in? So yeah, so again, making sure that you know what process safety management system means for your facility is a good way of making sure you collect all this information. So we had a webinar a few weeks ago about safety cases and why they might be useful, even if it's not a regulatory requirement. And this is one of the reasons, because if you have a safety case available, you can put all of this type of information in there. You can have an appendix with all the roles and responsibilities so that people know what they are, and it's easy to find. If you don't have a safety case, it can be quite difficult for people to keep up to date. So I've got another one from Henry. Also, the safety critical tasks within the safety case should be aligned with the job competence profile, which is not always the case. Yes, Henry, I definitely have seen that is not always the case. And often when we identify the safety critical tasks, we're not thinking about the whole picture. We're just thinking about the task that is the operator does or the task that the maintenance does. We're not thinking about the whole picture of how that safety critical element is put in place, how it is commissioned, how it is operated and maintained. So we don't think about that whole picture. And maybe also we're not thinking about procurement, because they play a key role, having the right competence in procurement, making sure we procure the right parts. That is critical to making sure our safety critical elements work when we want them to work. So yeah, definitely thinking about all of these different parts when we identify our safety critical tasks, and then mapping those over to our job descriptions and then identifying the job competencies is really good. So I saw Ashraf typing something more, probably a bit more about his process safety management system. Henry, can you let us know if you've seen the job competency profiles working really well and how you stored them? Who was responsible in your organization for looking after the job competency profiles? Was it HR, or did loss prevention have anything to do with that? So the employees themselves, so you're making them take ownership of their job competency profile. That's really good. Yeah. So I think that there's a balance as well, because we need to have some form of audit. So we need to have somewhere central that the tasks are recorded, so that somebody independent could come and audit each of the employees themselves, because sometimes you don't know what you don't know. I know that, for example, if you were an engineer and you didn't know much about hazardous area classification, if you just didn't know that it was a thing, how would you identify that that was one of your job competency profiles that was for your job and not for somebody else? You may assume that that was done by another discipline, even though in that organization, potentially, it might be assigned to your role. So it's good to have a central place where it's assigned, and then having a look at the gap assessment definitely is with the employee and empowering them. So I hope you guys are enjoying this format. So really, if you guys ask questions, share your knowledge, this is the kind of format that we are promoting here, giving you guys the most benefit from talking to myself, but also in future sessions, we've got other guests, and having this time to ask questions is really key. So I've got another comment from Henry. Is the assessment of employees' competencies carried out by a technical authority level 1 or 2? So I think that this varies in different organizations. This technical authority is very common language for organizations like Shell. But in other organizations like BP, they use something called an engineering authority. And then there are others where you might have other authorities defined. It's not always, in some cases, the assessment done by the technical authorities is not actually looking at your competence associated with your facility. So for example, if you're managing, one day you're managing a facility which has an oil pipeline, a gas pipeline, and some pumps and some gas processing. And then you may, after that, be moved over to a more gas system. So there's no oil processing at all. It's all gas, and it's liquefied gas processing. There's typically not a reassessment to see that you understand the difference between the hazards associated with the oil processing compared to the hazards associated with that sort of much more volatile liquid handling associated with the liquefied gas. I've had something from Ashok. Process safety management systems and safety cases are two different things. Process safety management systems covers design, operation, maintenance, and under operations is role and responsibilities, etc. So Ashok, I think it depends on which organization you're in. So the organizations I've been in, the process safety management system, yes, is an overarching thing, but the safety case at different stages in our operation tell us how we are executing that. So the process safety management system tells us what we should do, but it doesn't actually tell us how we're doing that at our facility. And it doesn't tell us how we're doing that in design or maintenance. So in the organizations I've been in, we've had a safety case, 2 safety cases in design, 1 for concept select, 1 for detailed design. And then we've had a safety case in operations, which is updated every 5 years. The one in operations covers everything, including how we might do design changes, MOCs, how we do the permit to work system, how we're doing the maintenance, and also the operation. So the safety case is telling us the how, we do it at our facility. And yes, the process safety management system is telling us what we should do. So is anybody on the line going through an organizational change right now, having some problems with making sure that management are aware of the different requirements for process safety? And how are you making sure that you communicate that up the line to get the right resources in the right place, so that you can make sure you continue to operate your facility safely? I know that in organizations I've worked in before and others that I've joined afterwards, it is a struggle to communicate these process safety competencies up the line, because if you do process safety well, nothing happens, right? Nothing goes wrong. So, and if nothing's going wrong, when they start to cut, they think, well, you know, process safety doesn't need a lot more resources, that maybe we have too much because nothing's happening. But they don't necessarily realize the reason that nothing's happening is because everybody knows their accountabilities and responsibilities, and they have the time and space to execute those. When you start cutting back an organization, then you start to create the holes in your barriers, and then that can start to lead to minor incidents and potentially major incidents. But it's very difficult to get that message across. I don't know if anybody has any experience they want to share, but getting the message across about how important it is to make sure that we keep these roles and responsibilities clear, how we can communicate those, even in times of significant financial pressure like we are under right now with the lower oil price and the COVID situation. Yeah, Ashraf mentions that he's in a big reorganization. Henry said that the successful critical maintenance activities are used as leading indicators for asset integrity. Yeah, Henry, that's a really good point. A lot of organizations currently don't use leading indicators, but there's some really good guidance out there from the Energy Institute as well as the HSE.gov on what leading indicators are. And then there's some guidance also from the CCPS if you are in America. So trying to identify some leading indicators for yourself is a really good way of understanding whether you've cut the organization too far. Sometimes it's not possible to identify before you cut, but if you can identify very soon after you've cut your organization so that you can improve quickly, then that might be a way of preventing an incident in the future. Yeah, so I mean, I think also the other thing is that sometimes in some organizations, people think process safety is done by the loss prevention engineers, the process safety engineers, or the technical safety engineers, when actually process safety is done by almost all disciplines. Almost everybody in the organization has a role to play in process safety. And so when they're cutting, sometimes it's a bit difficult for people to understand that different parts of the organization have different responsibilities. And even if you cut too far, for example, in the procurement part of the business, which maybe you think is okay, we can buy things in advance, we don't need to worry, our warehouse is stocked, that may impact process safety down the line. If we start to purchase, for example, we purchase the wrong size O-rings or the O-rings of the wrong material, then our seal could be compromised and we could have a localized loss of containment. So making sure that we have enough resources throughout our facility is critical within these changes. And it is a big challenge. As I said, in the presentation, making sure that you know exactly how everything ties together. for each of your hardware barriers, but then also for each of your safety critical tasks, which may be associated with operating procedures. All of those different things need to be clear, and it is very easy to cut too much. Because when everything is going well and you see that there's no issues, you feel like you can cut because there's no problems. So Henry said, our challenge as safety engineers is that sometimes we are only brought into the conversation when something has failed, and then we do catch-up investigations on why it failed. That's right. Often organizational change is seen as an HR activity, and safety and loss prevention engineers are not considered critical in that organizational change, right? They don't feel it is more about people and where we move people and how we manage the relationship with people, how we discuss with people, how they're going to lose their jobs, etc. So it's seen very much as an HR activity. And it's only when they've cut the organization or they've already announced the organization and people start saying, whoa, but I'm not going to be able to do my job if I've got to do all of these other things. And where are all these other people? And what things are we going to? Then we start getting involved. Or worst case, we only start getting involved once we've had an incident, which is a long time after we've had these failings. And it can actually be really difficult to catch back up with an organizational change. So if you've cut too much and you don't have all your roles and responsibilities defined, if you're trying to then catch back up, that can be actually quite difficult. So there was some recent incidents in India, and some of the causes listed in the newspapers associated with that was a lack of engineering competence. Now, what does that mean? Well, over a period of time, they had hired younger engineers or people who actually didn't have engineering competencies into engineering roles. And then by the time they had the incident, the organization had very young engineers or people who didn't have a solid engineering foundation. And then they have had the incident, but now they need to try and catch up. But actually, the competence isn't within their organization anymore to allow them to catch up, which means they need to hire somebody in from outside. But how do you identify who you need to hire in from outside, what competence they need to have, if you don't have any competence in your organization anymore to decide that? And that is some of the things that we saw in the 80s after the oil price crash. A lot of big organizations got rid of all of their engineers and started to outsource everything. And actually that meant that those organizations couldn't buy intelligently. And so actually they were spending a lot more money on outsourcing than they were when they had those people in their organization. Because when you go and you try and buy a car, if you don't really know much about cars, you can either land up with the most expensive car on the market or the most unreliable car on the market, which means you have a lot of maintenance costs associated with your change of car. So making sure you're an informed buyer, i.e. you have some of the competence required to buy the services you're looking for, is critical. Henry, so Saeed has said, would there be any certificate of competence for this webinar and PowerPoint as well? So Saeed, normally these are just safety forums, so we don't normally issue a certificate or anything for this. But if you want, I can send an email to say that you have attended and participated. There is a training session which will be run next week, and those will come with certificates and PowerPoints. And if you want to have a look at those, I'll put up a little thing for you to go to if you want to have a look at the training. But these webinars are not structured in the way that would require a certificate of completion. So on Henry's point, process safety needs to conduct a risk assessment on a defined interval. This will pick up the gaps in design, ops, and maintenance. So Ashok, yes, that's really good. And yes, we would normally conduct the risk assessment on a defined interval, but normally that defined interval is once every 5 years. Now, some of the facilities in the North Sea, I don't know if anybody keeps up to date with the improvement notices from the HSE, but some of the facilities in the North Sea, they had a long period where they pushed out fabric maintenance. So they were trying to expand their facilities because oil price was low, and they needed to get more oil coming into the facility. And so each year, different managers made the decision, well, we can cut back on fabric maintenance, but we need to bring this project team in. So maybe we had 10 fabric maintenance people on board, and now we need to have 8 project people. So, okay, we'll cut 8 fabric maintenance and just leave 2, so they can still be doing some things and the project people will come. Then when the project people left, something else was important and the fabric maintenance never got reinstated. And so if you look back at the improvement notices issued by the HSE over the last, say, 10 years, you'll see a lot of improvement notices associated with fabric maintenance. Fabric maintenance became a really big problem in the North Sea. It's quite a corrosive environment. As I said, when everything is going really well, you know, the guys are going around, they're basically painting the platform from top to bottom, and then they start again at the top and work their way back down. Things are going really well, right? The platform looks great. It's not corroding. So then you think, okay, well, everything looks great. We'll just put them off and we'll bring this project in and we'll reinstate them after. But then people change roles. You don't realize that it's that important if nothing's going wrong. And there were quite a lot of incidents of people falling into the sea where the gratings had corroded. There were fortunately incidents where people had managed to put their arms out so that when they fell, they were caught on the other gratings, but they had to hang there and wait for someone to come and rescue them. So those types of things, and where the handrails were corroding and people had fallen down off the side of the platform. So these types of things are things that drove the HSE to issue these improvement notices to a lot of different organizations, including some of the big players. Henry wants to add, there are some legacy equipment in the North Sea where it has met standards at the time, but no longer so. In addition, there are some obsolescent issues. That's right, Henry. So knowing who's responsible for what element in your bow tie, for example, if you have a pump or the most common obsolescence issue in the North Sea that I have seen is the kind of DCS, or the way in which we control our plant. So if we're using pneumatic controllers, and then the way that the information comes back to our control room. So making sure that the accountability for the DCS is very clearly with one person in the organization, so that they're conscious of any obsolescence issues which may impact the performance of that safety critical element, and they can start to plan for it. If it's not clear who's responsible, is it the asset manager? Is it the instrument manager? Is it one of the instrument engineers? Is it the safety engineer who should be identifying this because they're responsible for all the barriers? You know, if it starts to get a bit muddled, it can actually get to a point where you're in an urgent change position, and you never want to be in that sort of urgent change position, which actually is why most of the down manning organizational changes are the ones which cause the most problem, because most of the time you're down manning because you're responding to an external stimulus, which means that you're doing it in sort of like an emergency response mode, right? Something outside of your organization has happened, and then you realize you need to downman quickly because you don't have any money, right, to pay everybody until the end or whatever. So you're then emergency changing. You're getting panels together quickly to decide things. And when you're doing these sort of last minute changes, that's when things can start to fall through the cracks. It's much easier to do a change when you've got time to plan the change. So making sure that now, okay, maybe you're already undergoing a big change, but if you can, before you get into your next period where you might have some external stimulus to make a change in your organization, getting your accountabilities and responsibilities associated with process safety very clear on people's job descriptions, so that they can do what Henry suggested, doing a self-assessment, identifying where their gaps are, making sure that they can do improvements, etc. And then also maybe saying, okay, well, you know, maybe the whole process team have a gap in overpressure protection. There's 4 people in the process team. If each of them are doing their own gap closure for overpressure protection, it's probably not efficient. But if we have the whole team, maybe we can get someone in to help bring them up on that topic. So using this to structure your annual plans on how to train people. I've seen a lot of talks when you have a chat with your employees about what they're going to do that year. It's often not very structured. It's what the employee thinks is a good idea, or maybe what you think is a good idea, and it's not often structured around what the organization needs, right? It's more about what the person needs. It's never about, well, in the organization we have a gap with hazardous area classification, and so we've decided that we're going to build a competence in this area with these people, and so that will inform their improvement plan for the year. Those types of things I haven't seen work very well. I don't know if anybody has any experience where process safety is feeding back in to people's good performance or performance registers, and how that's managed as well with the senior management. For example, if you could, maybe you have identified an issue with your process safety leadership, which is causing the issues downstream in your organization. How is that built into people's performance indicators so that they can start to improve? So is there any more questions? Because if there's not, I don't have a lot more. I mean, obviously, if you ask questions, I can answer. But if there's no more questions, I'll try and wrap things up a little bit early and give you guys a bit more time back in your day. But I see a few people typing now. So I'm going to just have a sip of tea. Okay, so I have a question. Are there any examples or experience from outside oil and gas? So Henry, unfortunately, my examples are from in oil and gas, but I know that some of the incident reports, so one of the incident reports for the incident I mentioned in India, that is outside oil and gas, and they've had issues associated with engineering competence, organizational changes, cutbacks, which have impacted the performance of their safety barriers. And then there's also examples from the States. If you watch some of the CSB videos, there's some examples there where there has been pressure to cut and cut and cut. And those are also from outside oil and gas. So it depends really on what the driver is for the change. And obviously all different organizations have different drivers. I know that a few years ago, the mining industry had a big external driver because the price of the end products was dropping, and so they had a driver for cutting. So they may have gone through some changes. But again, also it depends on how mature the industry is and in terms of process safety management. I've got Elizabeth. So to have confidence that our metrics and indicators are giving us quality information, this means we need to have confidence that the data tests the assumptions. So yeah, so if we're trying to measure, so for example, if I'm trying to have a look at my performance on something, if I'm just starting to learn that thing, I go up this curve where I start to feel really confident that I can do everything about it. And then I start to realize that actually I don't know anything about it, and I come down. And then as I get more competent, I go a little bit further up the curve, but I never get to the point I was just after I started learning something. And so then I start to realize there's a lot of information that I need to know. So making sure that the people who are setting the metrics, who are testing the data and the assumptions associated, actually have the competence and experience to do that, so that they're not getting into sort of an overconfident space. And also, often people who are in these sorts of roles are overconfident anyway, because that's how they've managed to engage stakeholders. So really testing your assumptions on the data, yeah, Elizabeth, is key to making sure you understand your metrics and how it's working. Sometimes people, managers can have a I don't want any bad news attitude. Oh, you come with me bad. Oh, don't talk to me. And then people can try to manipulate the results so that it always presents good news. I have something from Ashok, and then I have another question. I've done a risk assessment of different sites in one company, which gives a percentage risk, and those sites maintain risk below a certain number that are facilitated. Ashok, if you can give us a little bit more information, what types of things fed into that percentage risk? Was it competence? Was it execution of safety critical tasks, or was it a combination of a lot of different things? I'll go to the question from Mohammed. What are the chances to get a job in process safety for a process engineer after doing the course which you have mentioned over there? So the course that I've mentioned, so the way I've structured my courses is to try and fit in with people's busy schedules. So I'm doing 1 to 2 hours. Mohammed, there's a lot of different things that you need to know to become a process safety engineer, but coming from a process engineering background puts you in a really good position. So there are other courses which give you a bigger certification, but they require a big block of time. For example, there's the ICME Process Safety Fundamentals course, but that's an 80-hour course, which obviously is a big financial commitment at once, but that gives you a really good foundation in process safety management. But it doesn't make you an expert in any element of process safety. So it's really what it is that you want to do, what a process safety engineer in your field needs. And that's why I've tried to structure my courses in small bites, so that if you think you need something on management of change, or you need something on overpressure protection or inherently safer design, you can just take the bits that you think you need. You do the introductory course, and then you can find out the things that you need to build your information on. But there are also a lot of other courses out there which can help you set a good foundation for process safety. But the main thing is to identify what it is you want to do in the future, and then start to fill a gap there. As Henry said, having a look at where you want to be, and then doing a gap assessment of where you are, and then start to work to close those. A really good continuous professional development is key to moving on to your next role. I've got another one from Ashraf. Most of the drivers of organizational change are cost reduction with no MOC in place to define the risk or mitigation. Your thoughts how to manage the risk due to reorganization, especially during a running asset or plant. So Ashraf, this is really true. Almost all of the organizational changes I've seen are driven by cost reduction. I've seen one organizational change where we did a management of change, and that was a struggle because it was something that we hadn't done before, right? We'd never done a management of change before, but because we had the roles, the responsibilities and accountabilities really well documented, it actually allowed us to do this management of change, right? Without those documented, it's really difficult to define the risk or mitigation, because you can't say, so for example, if you have 3 people doing a role and you decide you're going to keep one of them because they're the most competent, right? Or they're the cheapest, whatever the reason is for choosing that person, you choose that person, right? If you don't know what each of those people were doing to manage good process safety management, you don't know the risk of compressing that into one role. You don't know the risk of giving it to that person rather than one of the other 2. You're just maybe choosing that based on their willingness to work or their willingness to follow instructions or fit into the organization or their cost, right? That is not really a risk mitigation measure. You need to be looking at, okay, well, these are the things that I need to manage in the facility, and I'm going to compress these 3 roles into one. And of these 3 people, person B has the best competence to manage, say, 90 or 80% of those tasks. And so we would need to then do a handover period with the other 2 as they are offboarding to try and bring up that last 20%. The person you might be choosing might only have 20% of the competence, and you're letting go the others because they're more expensive, but that could leave you really exposed. So what my thoughts are is, if you're running an asset, you're already really busy. right? But try to document at least, even if you are subject to reorganization and you're not having any chance to provide any input, if you're the team lead, try to document what each of the people within your organization do to manage process safety, their responsibility and their accountabilities. And then have a look at the new organization and say, okay, well, I've got these 150 responsibilities and they were split between 10 people before, so they each had 15. Now you're only giving me 5. And so each of them need to have 30. But to do those, you know, they don't have the competence. So yes, please cut my organization by this, but please, I need additional training budget to train these people to do this. Okay, so that's maybe another way of, if you as your team lead can identify yourself, what the safety critical elements or tasks you are doing within your team, and then have a look at who you're left with, because you might be subject to the change. It's not your decision to make the change. And then say, okay, well, I'm left with these people. They don't have competence in this because you've got rid of this other person. And so therefore I need to train these people. And you need to give me budget to be able to manage the risk. And if we don't manage the risk, these barriers on the bow tie will be impacted, etc. But it really, I mean, you can do stuff as your team lead, but if you have a really good basis in your safety case of how we do process safety here, that will really help this. But if you don't, you can use your experience and knowledge of what your safety critical elements are and build up a case like that. I have something from Henry. Louise, is it beneficial to take examples from the airline industry where the tolerance for failure is close to nil? So we have had, I've had some interaction with the airline industry as well as with the nuclear industry. So both of those have a good focus on organizational change, but in no means are they perfect as well. So there are things that we do better in the oil industry than they do there. And then there's also things that they do much better there that we don't do in the oil industry. And it's really managing your risks, right? So if the plane is going to crash with 365 people on board, that's quite a big risk. The likelihood might be low. On your facility, if your facility is located in a very remote location, there is no environmentally sensitive receptors there, and everybody is located in the control room, which is quite a far way away from where you're operating, then the risk that you're managing is the number of people who are out on site might be impacted by your incident. Your risk is quite different to that of an airline industry risk, because the number of people that you can impact is less. And so then it comes down to financials and what financial drivers there are for your risk management. So before we start imposing a lot of new kind of steps in our organization, think through what we're managing. If we're on an offshore installation, the criticality of us managing our risks is higher, because if things go wrong on the offshore installation, there's often a potential to escalate, which can impact the whole population on the installation, which could be up to 200 people. If we're operating, for example, a lot of sites in the UK are operating very close to off-site populations, because the off-site populations have encroached on their area over time with poor planning. And so therefore, it's really critical. So really understanding the risk at your facility before you start putting in additional barriers. But with regards to organizational change, just doing the fundamentals of identifying your responsibilities, identifying your accountabilities, mapping those two roles, and then, as you said, Henry, doing your gap assessment yourself to see what it is you need to improve. I've got a few comments from others. We've got Saeed, who's an HSC coordinator from India. And then I've got something from Ashraf. Is all put together: design, risk, operations, MOC, number of leaks, maintenance in a year, and then work. Okay, so this is what Ashraf was talking about when he said he had his percentage, and that he would decide based on, well, he would do a ranking. Another good way of understanding where you are is talking to your insurer. So your insurer sees a lot of different organizations, and they can be quite knowledgeable on process safety because they see a lot of different things, and that's one of the main risks that they're trying to manage. So talking to your insurer, understanding what best practice is on other facilities, etc., can help you improve on your facility, because they might be able to share something, obviously without sharing names of other organizations, but they might be able to share something with you to improve. That's what works really well in the UK. So because the HSE see a lot of different organizations, they can identify best practices and then ask that organization to share the best practices with the industry. And that's what's helped drive everybody up on their process safety performance in the UK. So if you can use your insurer in that way, that might help drive your process safety performance up where you are. Okay, so if there's any more questions, we've got about 10 minutes left. I'm going to announce what the topic is now for next week. So next week, we're going to be looking at process safety culture again with Caroline. If you missed the first session, we're going to be running this one at 12 o'clock, so noon UK time, and that's to capture a different audience. So if you had any questions about process safety culture, you didn't get a chance to ask them last time when Caroline was on last week, or if you didn't attend the session at all, come along and Caroline be able to answer questions about process safety culture. She's really knowledgeable in the area, and the last session was very well received. And then the session after that is going to be by Jill Butler, and we're going to be looking at environmentally critical elements and how they marry with safety critical elements, and whether you need different system to be able to manage environmentally critical elements, and when environmentally critical elements may drive your risk. Okay, so, well, thank you very much, everyone, for joining. I really enjoyed this session, and I'm really looking forward to the future ones. I'm going to launch the feedback now, but if anybody has any more questions, please type them in the chat box, and I'll try and answer them through the chat while the survey's on. Thanks, Ashok. Thanks, Ashraf. Thanks, Henry. Really enjoyed the session and the questions. Thanks, Mohammed.